See, now I feel really bad because I'm pretty sure there's not a single graphical model in this talk. Except in fairness, almost everything that I'm going to talk about, we do in my head and in my group's heads think about in terms of graphical models. I just wasn't going to show them because I was trying to avoid having too much math because I figured at 3 in the afternoon on a Friday, the last thing anybody wants to see is an equation. So I'm pretty sure I kept all of them out of here, but we'll see. So thank you for inviting me. It was a little bit odd when I got the invitation because out of curiosity, I went back and looked because you've got this wonderful search function that will search inside all the documents. So I'd search in the folder that has my published papers to see, have I ever used the word curiosity in a published paper? And I discovered that I've used it exactly 3 times in a 15-year publishing career. The first is some of the stuff I'm going to talk about here. So yay on that. The second is when I talked about self-driving cars as being no longer just a curiosity in the city of Pittsburgh. And the third is when I was trying to give a motivational story and talked about my daughter exhibiting more curiosity just after her nap, which surprised me because I didn't think that that's when they would be curious, back when she was young. So I don't normally think of myself as doing anything with curiosity, except the more I started to think about it, it's almost as though I had Jackie's slides ahead of time, because actually I think a lot of what I say is going to follow very nicely from some of the things you're saying. Because at a high level, the thing that has probably bound together, I don't have much of a theme that binds together all the work I do, but to the extent that there is one, it's probably been this constant drive to try to figure out how any agent can function in an unbelievably complicated world. So exactly that issue of complexity that's the sort of thing that drives the machine learning work and AI work I do. It's driven a lot of the modeling I've done to try and understand how we humans handle this. So, all right. So let me make an effort. So I'm going to be bringing together a lot of different things in the talk. Hopefully it will all cohere. I apologize in advance if it doesn't. So if we think about curiosity during learning, so this isn't curiosity that prompts me to start asking a question. Given that I'm learning, what is the notion of curiosity in these kinds of contexts? So here's an idea that I think has already started to kind of come up. Curiosity is something like learning without a specific reason. You don't have anything in particular in mind. You're just trying to, learn about things. Now, this is actually, I think, a very natural way to think about curiosity if you have what I would call the kind of standard view of learning. The standard view of learning, I would argue, is that learning is about producing vertical representations. It's about getting your cognitive representations to, in some sense, mirror the world around you. Okay? And to use the philosophical language, they should truth track, right? That if the world had been different, your representations would have been different in exactly the sorts of ways that would enable it to continue to mirror the world. And so to the extent that you have goals or reasons for learning, they play a role only in terms of sort of setting the domain. So if I'm wanting to learn French, I'm going to pay attention to the utterances coming out of somebody's mouth, not the color of their shirt, right? But so goals, motivation, those tell you the kind of thing to look at, but they don't necessarily have an impact on learning beyond that because learning is about mirroring. Learning is about truth tracking. I think it's a caricature, but it's actually, I think, a reasonable picture of a kind of standard view of learning, at least in cognitive science. Okay? So let me actually go back, right? So if you have this view of learning, then the idea of curiosity is learn a lot actually is a very natural way to go. And I think, for example, the Lowenstein et al. Model of curiosity as essentially the utility of information acquisition or the utility of uncertainty reduction exactly fits this kind of picture. You've got uncertainty about the state of the world. To the extent that you reduce it, that is to say your representations track more of the relevant features in the environment, then you've learned, you've gained in that way. Right? Now, the first thing to notice is this is actually a kind of weird thing to say. You can't, here's a philosophical point, you can't have truly goalless learning. Right? If you think of a goal, at the very least, a goal tells you what would count as success. Right? So at the very least, even when you say, oh, you're just trying to learn. Well, you're trying to learn presumably truths. Right? If you just randomly learned learned a bunch of stuff. If you randomly got a collection of beliefs, we wouldn't say that that was goalless learning. We'd say that was having random thoughts, right? So at the very least, you can't have truly goalless learning. So the idea, I think, behind this intuition has got to be something like, you've got a goal. The goal is, discover truths or discover interesting truths or something like that, right? Now, the problem with that is, of course, you can't, here's another philosophical point, you can't actually find out if you're getting closer to the truth, right? We don't get a, sort of Archimedean point of evaluation. You don't get to step outside of the world and have a measure of the extent to which your representations track the true structure of the world. We don't know what the true structure of the world is. That's why we're trying to learn it, right? So it's a kind of, point from philosophy of science that you can't actually directly evaluate how closely your representations track the truth of the world. Instead, what you're really doing, I would suggest, most of the time, is you're looking for converging success, right? So with this method, I can use my representations to make accurate predictions in this domain. I can control things in these ways. I get the same information about the shape of this water bottle by both looking at it and touching it, right? Those kinds of convergent pieces of information. The fact that things converge on a single set of representations, we take as a signal that we're getting closer to truth. Okay? So the problem with this, though, is that sometimes, depending on the goal you have for learning, the best way to represent the world will conflict. So let me give an example of this. So the first thing to say is it's of course uncontroversial that you should think about the world differently depending on your goal, right? So here's a different city with lots of rivers, namely Pittsburgh. And if I want to get from Carnegie Mellon to downtown, here's a bus map that tells me how to get there. If instead I'm going to walk, I might want a topographical map that tells me don't go over the hill, go around the hill. So that's uncontroversial and kind of not very interesting. The more interesting cases are the following. Let me give an example of a case where, depending on the goal you have, you get incompatible pictures of the world. Right? So in fact, converging success cannot happen in this domain because there's no single representation of the world that works for all the goals you have in mind. Okay? So there are these things that we call ocean indices. They're basically compact representations of the temperature and pressure around large patches of the ocean. So El Nino and La Nina are by far the best known ones, and they exhibit these things we call, let me say that for the moment, right? So here's an example. It turns out there's a lot of them that happen all over, that are all over the ocean, okay? Now, and of course they have, the reason we care about them in many cases is because they have real impacts on terrestrial phenomena, on land-based phenomena. So how are these actually constructed? Well, the way they're actually constructed, this is old, I think this is about 8 years ago. This was the location of the buoy network. Buoys that float out in the ocean that have, in many cases, little tiny propellers on them to try and keep them in the same location, right? And they're just recording monthly measurements. And so the North Atlantic Oscillation is roughly the pressure readings up around in here. Right? And it's just an aggregate. It's the average reading across that whole big region. If you don't like this example, think about things like a cold front, or perhaps even more controversially, activation in a particular brain region, right? A collective that's making a difference. Now you might ask yourself, okay, how should we parcellate the world? The oceans, how should we divide them up into ocean regions, into ocean indices? Well, here's two different goals you might have in mind. One is that you're looking for patches of ocean that tend to move together in terms of temperature and pressure. Right? Within the index, the behavior is highly correlated. Right? A different goal you might have is that the causal structure between these indices is stable. Right? So we know, for example, that El Nino is a cause of the Pacific Decadal Oscillation. I think I'm getting that one right. And so you might say, well, the right way to carve things up is in a way that gives you these kinds of stable causal relations. Two different goals. To the extent that the goalless discover the truth idea is going to work, these ought to come to the same answer in the long run, if we could imagine that we could get infinite data in some sense, right? Well, so the problem is, So one thing you could do is you could do the intra-index uniformity, right? And if you do that, you get things that don't look very much like the ocean indices that oceanographers and climatologists like to talk about. For example, the North Atlantic Oscillation corresponds to multiple indices in the clustering, the intra-index thing. A different thing you could do is look for stable causal structure. When you do that, it turns out that the classic indices work great. They give you really stable structures over time. Stable causal structure, right? So I did get it wrong. It's an indirect cause. El Nino is a southern oscillation, right? And it's an indirect cause of Pacific decadal oscillation consistently over time, right? So we seem to have this case where, in fact, you can't reduce one to the other. These are, in an important sense, incompatible ways of thinking about the world. And moreover, each is better for its own goal. Right? In fact, it turns out that the uniformity clusters are better at predicting what's going to happen, things like snowfall, than the traditional ones. Right? But as we already saw, you get a nice stable causal structure with the traditional indices. You get spaghetti with the ones that exhibit within index uniformity. Right? So what's the moral of all this? The moral of it is that this idea of having this one overarching goal, discover the truth, that you can get at through converging success is a bit of a will-o-wisp. Because, in fact, it turns out this case is not anomalous. It's not because of the limits of finite data that we have. It turns out that there's a very wide class of cases that even if you had infinite data, different goals lead you to incompatible representations of the underlying system. So that's a problem, I would suggest, for actually, here I'll say, sorry, but like, for example, the information reduction curves, that's a bit of a problem for them, right? Because those kinds of curves are based on the idea that there is some information set where we can talk about reduction in uncertainty over the set. Now, let me make sure I'm being clear. There are such information sets, but they're goal relative. Okay? There's not a single one that will work for every single goal, at least that will work optimally for every single goal. You aren't necessarily going to get the converging success, so very fast early conclusion, this idea of curiosity is just learning with the single goal, the single very broad or overarching goal, discover the truth, isn't going to work. I should say, by the way, this idea that you can't have a single goal, which is learning to discover the truth, took me about 5 years to finally convince myself that it was okay to believe that you can't have a single goal of discovering the truth. I really didn't want to believe the work that led to this conclusion, but was kind of compelled to after doing a lot of cases. So what should we do instead? Well, 0 doesn't work, 1 doesn't work, let's try many, right? So here's a kind of conjecture. What it is to be curious, at least in part, is curious during learning, is that you have many goals that are operative during the course of learning. You're not learning for one reason or for one goal. You're learning for lots of goals, in some sense simultaneously. Now, I have no idea whether it makes sense to even say learning simultaneously. Maybe it's a really rapid cycling between the goals. That isn't going to be an issue I'm going to worry about at the moment, or in this talk, because I don't have anything to say about that. But that's the thought, is maybe what it is to be curious is that you actually just care about lots of goals all at the same time. Right? That's what distinguishes curious people, or a curious episode, from being goal-oriented. You might think of it as that's the difference. So, if I'm curious about something, I don't just look and say, oh, well, how does this system work? I say, how does it work? I wonder what happens with this light. What happens if I push this button? What would happen if I took it and threw it in the water? Right? Anecdote time. A good friend of mine in college he was a very curious individual, and he found the dream job. For a summer, he was hired by Nokia to break their phones. And so he basically would go in every day and say, I wonder what happens if you drop a rock from 5 feet above 20 times on the phone. Will that break it? Like his job was to come up with these crazy ideas to try and break phones. And that was a certain amount of this kind of curiosity. He had lots of different goals he was trying to satisfy at one moment. So what I want to do for the remaining 20, 25 minutes I've got is try and explore this idea some and try to motivate that it might actually get at a lot of the things that are often held forth as the real benefits of curiosity. But I'm going to do it in a somewhat roundabout way. Because I want to do it by starting out by thinking about what it is to do single goal learning. Right? So I told you that, I hopefully convinced you in 5 minutes, that you can't have the single goal of discover the truth. But of course you can have very specific single goals. So one of the things that we did is we tried to think about what is it to optimally learn for a particular goal. So we built we've got a normative model for single goal learning. And the idea is there's an incredible complexity to the world. What the goal does is, and this is very, I think, resonant with some of the things Jack was saying, what the goal does is it imposes a partition on states of the world. Right? So if I'm trying to learn how many people are in this room, right, that imposes a partition where the state of the world in which Celeste is sitting here and the state of the world in which her chair is 5 feet to her right count as the same world. Right? Because for the purposes of that goal, they have the same content. Okay? And so for single goal learning, you're indifferent between the worlds that end up within a particular partition zone. You don't care which one of them it is for the purposes of that goal. Now, that means that from the point of view of the normative model, there is absolutely no reason from within the model to have any preference between those different worlds in terms of the learning. Right? So that means, for example, if what I really care about is the number of people in the room, I should be indifferent between believing that Celeste is sitting here and Celeste is sitting 5 feet to her right. Sorry to pick on you, this is what you get for being in the front seat. Right? Now, of course, I know where she's actually sitting, I can look, but for the purposes of that single goal, I'm indifferent to that. And in fact, there might be external reasons, not in the sense of reasons outside of the particular learning context, to learn something that's wrong or something that's false. And so, for example, in the 1980s, there's a well-studied case of doctors having systematic false beliefs about the mechanisms that generate blood pressure readings. And the short version of it is the systematic false beliefs did not lead to any predictive errors. They could do their job just as well, and the false beliefs fit really beautifully with a simple mental mechanical model in terms of hydraulics. Or a similar sort of case, there are widespread false beliefs about the relationship between the strength of a heart and the size of a heart. And it turns out that most people have the wrong causal direction. But it turns out it doesn't matter. It's equally good for diagnostic purposes, and it fits with a mental model of how most muscles work. So that was one thing we sort of liked about this model. It actually could explain why people would often have false beliefs. And these are false beliefs that are very resistant. It's not as though doctors weren't exposed to the underlying physiology. They knew what caused blood pressure readings in a certain sense of no. But yet, after 5 years, none of them would give the right answers as to how it actually worked. Right? And actually, this helped us to make sense of a lot of data that we collected earlier that we looked and said about people's causal learning, where people would give systematically incorrect judgments, but they weren't, we would get the differences we wanted. They just were, odd in certain ways. And we said, we're not going to worry about that. But actually it makes sense if what you're trying to do is succeed at the task we'd given them. We thought that we were getting them to learn about the causal structure. What they were actually doing was a different task, we think now. So, well, that means actually that there's an enormous benefit to having multiple goals. And the benefit's the following. Suppose I have 2 goals. One goal is to learn the number of people in the room. The second goal is to learn something about the distribution of chairs in the room relative to these tables. If I have 2 goals, each one, at a caricature, each one imposes its own partition over the arbitrarily complex states of the world. Having both goals simultaneously means that I'm actually going to look at the overlap partition, which will be an even finer grained way of carving up the world than I otherwise had. So multiple goals will give me more complex representations, more detailed representations, representations that might be useful when I want to go on to some new task within a non-stationary environment or because I get a new goal that I've never had before. So there's a benefit to having multiple goals, even when you're told what single goal to use. If this is all right. So of course you ought to be saying, well, nice normative model that predicts that there'd be this nice benefit if curiosity has multiple goals. Is there any empirical evidence for something like the normative model? So we set out to try and figure this out. And we thought, what is the simplest possible case where we should see behavior like this if our model were right? Now we thought we actually oversimplified, but let me explain the general design of the experiments. It's really simple. There are going to be 4 buttons. When a button is pushed, you get a number. Okay? That's the structure. You're not going to push them. The machine pushes them for you. But so you're just sitting there and you're passively seeing these numbers pop up connected to the buttons. For the experimental design, every subject is going to see the exact same sequence. Right? We tell them it's random which numbers come up, that they're drawn from a distribution, but it's not random, it's deterministic, we control it all. And so the only thing that's going to vary between subjects, between conditions, are, for example, in experiment 1 that I'm going to show you, the only thing that varied between subjects was 1 sentence in the cover story, which told them what goal they needed that they were going to have. Okay? So let me give you the phenomenology of it. So one goal would be max. Your job is to choose the button with the largest average value. Okay? A different one is min. Choose the button with the smallest average value. Let's do this. Audience participation. It's after a break, so you got to wake you up. If you're on this side of the, this double table, so if you're on this side, you have the max goal. If you're on this side, you have the min goal. Okay? And I'm going to show you 2 trials. Our subjects got 10, but I'm going to show you 2. Right? So min goal over here, max goal over there. Right? Okay. Okay. Want to see those again? Yeah. Okay. Go do them again. You guys had the max goal. What number was the smallest? Which one? You guys, don't laugh. You had the min goal. Which one? Which button had the biggest average? You guys can let them know. Which one had the biggest average?
B was first round. D was.
But which one had the bigger average? B. And the smallest one was C, if you're curious. Right? But your reaction when I asked you which one was the smallest is exactly the point. Okay? Notice what the goal has done. The goal made it so you didn't even learn something that the other people thought, oh, of course we can learn this. This is easy. Right? So it's a case where it was absolutely learnable, which is why we had to have the average task, where your job was to learn the averages of all 4. We needed to make sure it was a learnable problem. But the thought was, people might not be learning anything or very little about the goal irrelevant stuff, even though it's eminently learnable. Okay? Now, so what happened when we did this? Well, first things first, people do pretty well on their own goals. Right? So this is just binary forced choice. Are you able to pick between the 2? Right? And yes, people are largely good. Interestingly, they weren't perfect, which surprises me. But that's another thing. Not different from chance on the goal irrelevant stuff. Okay, well, what about button estimates? Right? Those are forced choices. What happens with the button estimates? Well, the goal relevant estimates all are significantly different from one another on average. The goal irrelevant buttons are not significantly different as mean estimates. Well, all right, these are mean estimates. Maybe we have mixed populations. Maybe some people are really good. So instead we look at the mean differences within each individual to try and get at that. Once again, the actual true mean difference was 10. people are decent for their goal relevant, and they're much, much worse on the goal irrelevant. So this was pretty exciting because we didn't think we could get these kinds of effects, right? The goal, the standard view says what the goal should be doing is telling you pay attention to numbers. But if that's all the goal did, then you would presumably have learned everything because it was learnable, right? So the thought was, well, all right, this is intriguing that the goal is having this kind of dynamic impact, and it happens fast. Right? We only showed them 10 trials. It's not as though they were seeing lots of trials, so they were really rapidly learning about only a few things. So we thought, all right, let's see if we can break it. This was my thought, because I thought I was entirely wrong in my prediction about what was going to happen in this experiment. What happens if we just show the people all 10 button presses for one of the buttons, then all 10 button presses for another button, and so on through all 4? Okay. So at any moment in time, there will only be one number on the screen, and they'll see 10 straight numbers. Right? Somebody earlier asked about passive learning. I mean, there's nothing else to look at. Now, granted, these are MTurk participants, so they could have, I'm sure there's other things they could look at. They also couldn't click right through. We forced it to stay on the screen, I think, for 2 seconds at least before they could click to the next one. Right? And they had to do a click. It wasn't like it was just presented automatically. So what should people learn? Well, if goals have this absolutely overwhelming impact, then, well, what we varied was whether you saw the goal irrelevant buttons first or the goal relevant. So put yourself in the mindset of the max group, right, where the true max is 80. Right? That's the mean of the maximum. If I show you a button, if the first button presses you see have a mean of 20, you ought to learn that because you don't know what the scale is. Right? So if I show you 20 and 30, then 70 and 80, you ought to learn everything if I show you the goal irrelevant first because you don't know any better. If I show you the 70 and 80 first and then the 20, 30, this single goal learning view predicts you should be, again, at chance in distinguishing between the goal irrelevant buttons. Right? Strong prediction, I think, in this sense, because yes, it's mechanical Turk, but there's still nothing else to look at. Right? And this would be even further confirmation that there's some sort of really dynamic adjustment going on to the learning, right? Because the order is really shaping what you learn in this very responsive fashion. So first thing to show, right? So this is the replication of experiment 1. Oops, this wasn't supposed to come up this fast. Oh well. So first of all, we replicated experiment 1. If I show you the large number ones first, people were again at chance on distinguishing which of the lower numbers was smaller. There's nothing else to look at. And yet they still didn't learn passively which was bigger. If you see the irrelevant first, you learn everything as though you are one of the people whose job is to learn everything. Okay? So your beliefs about in this case, about what the range of possibilities could be, is having this incredibly dynamic, real-time impact on what you learn. And we see the same things when we look again at the button estimates. Amazingly, if you're in the max group, you give, on average, the mean estimates for the min buttons, not significantly different from one another. If you are shown the irrelevant first, you learn everything. Same thing with the mean differences. We just get this really striking result, I think, for this very dynamic process that's going on. How much time do I actually have? When should I finish to give time for questions? I wasn't sure when we started.
You could finish in the next. Yeah, we started late, so you could take less than 10 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes is plenty because I'll show you experiment 3. I'm not going to show you experiment 4 because it's complicated. I'll just give you the punchline for it. Experiment 3, though, I think is particularly relevant, especially in light of Jeff's talk. So what we have is this idea that goals and evaluations influence learning, which leads to partial knowledge. There's at least 2 mechanisms by which that could occur. Probably probably more. One is that there's a kind of dynamic attention allocation. You're changing how you allocate your attention, which on this view, the idea would be, you sort of pay more attention to these two buttons, right? But given that you pay attention to something, you sort of fully learn about it, would be the thought, right? A different possibility would be a kind of re-representation, right? That you represent, oh, well, C could have had these different values, but I don't actually care, right? I can lump a bunch of them together, right? So what you're doing is you're sort of taking the small ones and saying, they're somewhere between 0 and 30, whatever it is, it doesn't matter. So you're fully attending to them, but you're just representing their content as small, or their mean is small, right? So you get these two different pictures. These are not mutually exclusive, of course. So we did experiments to test each of them. I'll tell you about the one to test the dynamic attention allocation. So we used eye tracking, not in the sophisticated way that you were pointing out, but in the sort of usual kind of dumb way of just looking at gaze fixation, which required changing the structure a little bit. Well, we just basically redid experiment 1, but with an eye tracker, and we had to add a couple of goals because it turns out there was a difference in the task complexity between the max, min, and average. Average had to learn the numbers. Max and min just had to learn which was greater. They just had to learn the ordinal information. So we had to change it so that we have now also conditions where our max and min, but with cardinal estimates, not just ordinal. And so, of course, you can't do enter with eye tracking. So my collaborator Jörg Hagmar in Göttingen ran these. So we first replicate all of the behavioral results we've been getting in terms of the mean button estimates. We get the same sorts of, if you're in the average condition, you learn everything. Otherwise, you don't learn about, on average, you don't distinguish between. Let me be clear about that. Obviously, you're learning something. The max people don't have bars up here. Right? So you're learning something, but you're not learning those kinds of information. Again, in terms of the differences in button pair estimates, here's the interesting thing, the looking time. So if you're in the average group, that is your job is to learn all the averages, you get a nice, relatively clean, uniform distribution of looking time. These are the normalized ones. You look more at the button relevant than at the button irrelevant. And as you have a harder task, namely learning the actual value of the mean, not just which is bigger, you further weight towards the goal relevant buttons. If you look at the absolute looking times, first note, we get in looking times, this is that difficulty difference, right, that we worried about. It turns out we were right to worry about it because it does take a lot more effort to learn the actual values. Go figure, right? That's not surprising. So the conclusion we take from this is actually that it does seem like attention allocation is, at least as understood in terms of gaze fixation, is doing a lot of work in this. That part of what's going on is that you are on the fly changing what you're looking at. You're just not looking at the irrelevant stuff. You very quickly figure out that it is irrelevant, and you just don't look at it. Right? I'll skip through experiment 4, and I'll just give you the punchline of experiment 4, which is we tried a bunch of different things, and we couldn't get any evidence that re-representation is happening. It just doesn't seem that people are using a coarsened representation of the goal irrelevant stuff. It does seem to be roughly a picture where attention is roughly acting as a kind of gating mechanism for information. As long as you attend to it, you learn it. You just don't necessarily attend to things that you understand to be goal irrelevant. So goals matter for learning. Single goals matter for learning. People dynamically adjust in very rapid and sophisticated ways that depend on both prior knowledge and knowledge accumulated in the course of learning. It looks like attention allocation is a way that this is happening. It doesn't look like it's a representational thing. It looks like it's, in a certain sense, a kind of lower, as it were, level thing. So let's come back to this goal thing, right? So if we've got the idea that single goal learning is really highly focused, what multiple goal learning does is it's balancing these different needs that we have, right? You're getting a richer representation, which gives you a higher probability of success when you get a surprise challenge, exactly the sort of thing that we've already been hearing about, where you don't know what you're going to have to do. If you're curious, part of what you're doing is you're prepping yourself for future success. It's kind of pragmatic justification of curiosity. If you're curious, there's actually a kind of evolutionary argument for it. The curious individuals are the ones that, when they're in a really messed up, complicated world that throws new challenges at them, they're prepared for it. Because they've learned more than just how to do this one narrow task. Right? So as the environment changes, as your needs change, right? And this fits, I think, with a much broader view that one of the huge advantages that humans have historically had, in a certain just so story kind of way, has been our adaptability, our ability to adjust to changing circumstances and changing needs. And in fact, the suggestion is curiosity might be a mechanism by which we've been able to do that. Right? That it might be, in some sense, the implementation of this kind of ability. That's the speculation. So obviously lots of open possibilities, open questions, right? The neuroscience of attention should be directly relevant to thinking about curiosity. To the extent that curiosity is about multiple goals, it should mean that you should be paying attention to things that are not relevant to your immediate goal. Well, that means we need to think about these connections between goals and representations of goals and those attention allocation mechanisms. I think it hopefully goes without saying that there are lots of aspects of curiosity that probably aren't operationalized in this way, though I think that this might well get at an interesting core. I think it actually might give a kind of continuity between children and curious adults. I think one way to think about kids is kids don't learn, they're not as able, or don't, tend to focus on very specific single goals. Right? They tend to learn for lots of things. They tend to be open to trying new things, not because it's going to lead to an immediate success, but because, who knows? They're curious, is often what is said. Well, that suggests that what they're doing is they're learning for multiple goals. They have all these different goals in mind, all at the same time or quite quickly. Well, maybe curious adults are those who, continue to have lots of different goals in mind. It also points out what already came up earlier today, which is a potential downside of curiosity. It leads to being distracted. Right? If I really do just have one thing I need to do, it might be that curiosity actually makes things harder on me precisely because I'm learning more than I needed to. I'm learning things that aren't relevant to success at the task. Please note the word conjecture. So I think curiosity can't be goalless learning, but it could be something like many-goal learning, and I think that would be a really interesting direction to maybe pursue that I hadn't thought about until getting invited to come here. So thank you for that. I appreciate it. So thanks.